Hey, good morning, Chris. It's
Hi,
webinar
Ron.
day.
Yeah,
How's
I'm
it going?
excited. Great. How are
Yeah,
you doing today?
good, great. Today's going to be a really easy one. So to kind of bring the group up to speed, we've touched on notifications, especially when it comes to bidding, making sure your bid's going to be outbid. And on the last webinar, Chapter 9, we talked briefly about notifications with regards to B2B, but we haven't really dove into all of the notifications throughout the whole thing, and even custom notifications, especially with regards to the seller. So today's going to be a little bit faster, but we're really going to dive in and talk about all the different notifications.
That's right, Ron. And this is a really interesting topic because for a lot of our clients, what we've seen is because they have a specific model for their business and their customers interact with their sellers interact with their buyers in a certain way, it's really, really helpful to have unique and specific customizable notifications, customizable workflows. And then it also is really helpful for them to just understand going into a project what is possible, like what's standard in the industry, what is excellent look like. What are some of the key things that we see the very best auction sites doing so that they can replicate that within their particular scenario. And just to kind of start us out with that, I think, one of the biggest things is the idea of making sure everything is configurable with the notifications, right, Ron?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And notifications, a lot of people think notifications are simple things like notifications about my bid, but notification could be, hey, a potential buyer is asking you a question. And if you don't get back to them very quickly with a response, they're going to drop out and not bid. So notifications might be something about a seller has a question, or the seller has a question about shipping. They're not going to buy something if they don't know how it can be shipped over to the UK, and now your global buyers are out because they can't get a hold of you, right? So notifications can be around, we talked about the scouts. Remember, you'd mentioned the scouts a couple webinars back where investors might be out of town, but they might go on the auction site and say, I want to be notified if anything comes up that's liquidation of tools, or if any investment properties come up, I need to be notified. So notifications can be about things that haven't even started yet, have nothing to do with auctions. It has to do with searches and potential auctions that are going to be scheduled for future use, right?
That's right. And one of the things that I find so annoying about certain platforms is whenever I do sign up for notifications and it just spams me constantly.
Yeah,
And, that is something that really, by making the notifications configurable, and this is a really important point for folks that are listening. If you don't make the notifications highly configurable, you will be spamming a lot of your users. That's just what ends up happening. So we want to tell you very directly, whenever you're looking to set this up, please make sure that whoever you're working with has the ability to turn these notifications on and off and change the frequency and just kind of what the rules are, that so that the user can actually apply those settings if they choose to. A lot of times they won't. A lot of times the user wants the system to be opinionated and intelligent. And that's really what whenever we're working with clients, we're going to work with them and recommend certain settings based on what's best practice within the industry. Nonetheless, though, there is always room for optimization. And one of the things that we want to make sure that the end user has, so they have a really awesome experience, is control and the ability to essentially self-direct those notifications and how often they get them. So this would be things like notify me immediately, accumulate all the notifications into a daily notification, only notify me weekly, except for these things, and notify me right away if it's this. And so these are the type of settings that we're talking about when we say, making them configurable. But like you said, Ron, I mean, there are so many different aspects of the platform that different bidders on auctions, different sellers might be particularly interested in. I mean, goodness, you can really get into the weeds here, can't you? And you can have sellers getting notified about other auctions that are going on so they can see when
yeah,
an auction was finished and then go list theirs right away because there were so many
right.
people that lost. Maybe they want the same thing.
Sure.
You you can have groups of people that have a favorited item, that again, maybe they didn't win the bid, and they didn't get the auction. So they may want to be notified of everything that matches their favorites, and the list goes on and on. And you can think of all kinds of permutations here. One of the most powerful things in marketing today is email and being able to use text and notify people who have already opted in. That is one of your most powerful. And if you think about it, it's technically literally a limitless marketing avenue that you can take advantage of. And it doesn't technically cost you per transaction. So this is
Right.
a really powerful area, but we want to make sure that we don't abuse it.
Totally agree. Matter of fact, right now, folks, I'll go ahead and put up a screenshot of another one of the auction platforms we designed, and it has, as you can see here on the screen, it has all the different configuration options that somebody can go in and do the notification. So in this particular case, we sat down with the client, we talked about best practices, talked about their specific business, and then came up with these options. And you can see there's quite a few of them here on the screen. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the bidding process. This one should be relatively quick since we've touched base on this one. Right, Chris?
That's right, Ron. And basically, the main point that we want to make here and just ask you to consider is how much more engagement can we get if at every phase of the bidding process of an auction, we're directly interacting with the customer, both the seller and the buyer, and directing traffic, if you will, and really just kind of like keeping them engaged, right? And so there's a lot here, and we have talked about this before. We really want you to think critically in your scenario about how a few notifications can make all the difference. If you look at just generally like marketing automation and what's happening today in the industry, a lot of it is about human just kind of nature and making sure to help people and encourage them to kind of stay engaged in the process. And that's what this is all about.
Absolutely. Totally agree. And if you remember back to chapter 7, we talked about the auction types, and notifications completely changed from a normal English auction to a reverse auction, right? I mean, because the whole thing flip-flops, and now all of a sudden notifications midstream are so much more important on a reverse auction, because as the price is going down and things are happening, you can lose out very, very quickly, because it's kind of like, it's almost a game of chicken in a reverse auction. The first one that blinks, they win. It's not like you have an opportunity on a traditional English auction where if I see there's still 2 days left in the auction or 20 minutes left in the auction, if I get outbid, I'm back in the game. And in a reverse auction, when the price is going down, the first one that says, great, I'll buy at that price, they win, and off it goes. So things like notifications of how many are in stock and how many are being sold, and is it a lot? And are there any other auctions of this item if I lose out on this one? And maybe I'll let the first one go just so I can let it set the price, and I don't want to bite too quickly because then the price sets high. So everybody's kind of allowing the price to go down a little bit lower. They don't want to lose out. So notifications are very important, both on the auction you're on and potentially other similar auctions, especially for reverse auctions there. And then obviously on the additional steps, right? So again, we're talking about the bidding process here, but what if I win a bid and now it's a property, and the very first thing I have to do now is I have to put in my earnest money within X number of minutes, X number of hours, X number of days, and then I have to support and supply this document, and then I have to be notified that I only have 5 days to get my own third-party inspection done, right? There's all kinds of notifications that can really muck up something. So you have to get notified through all of the steps, not just the bidding on an item, but winning a bid and paying for that item that you've won and shipping that item, and even maybe the verification and validation process of funds and getting into escrow and all the things that we've talked about in previous chapters, right? So let's go ahead and move on and talk about, because I think this one's really important. Let's go ahead and have you kick off the interactions one, right? It was kind of the very first statement we made, right? That the buyer and seller interactions is really important. But This first one here, where we're talking about a minimum reserve, is kind of a weird item because you think about it. If I was selling a car and I was hoping to get 50K, but I put a $40,000 minimum reserve, why theoretically, let's talk about this. Why would I need to be notified? Am I just notified when it finally hits 40 and then I'm like, woohoo, I'm going to make money, and so now I'll go watch the auction? What other types of notifications could I potentially get as the seller? Because I think this one's really cool and really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And the reality is the seller may need to be willing to make adjustments on the fly to maximize the auction. So they may need to adjust that minimum reserve down in order to keep the bidders engaged. And it really depends on the type of auction that we're running. But fundamentally, we may end up needing to kind of coach both the seller and the buyer through what this auction is supposed to look like, and sort of based on what's happening with the auction, send notifications to the seller and essentially say, hey, look, if you move this minimum reserve down, or, here's some common recommendations for auctions like yours. If you do this, in some cases, we've seen this, and that might help
Yeah.
them to, maximize their actual auction, as opposed to leaving a really high reserve amount and then no one engages, right?
Yeah, you see that in live auctions a lot, right? You watch it and then you hear them in the room yell, "Reserve is off." And sometimes it's like, oh, wow, a frenzy's going to happen. And it does. And other times it's like, not one more bid and it just closes. So you never know what it does. But obviously the thought is, let's think through this. And best practice says that, and whatever the number is, 63% of the time, taking the reserve off when there's a bunch of engaged bidders and the bids are stalled out can reignite that frenzy, because now they know the item's going to sell and they really can buy it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that second interaction, we just mentioned it on the previous slide, was notifying the seller when a buyer has a question, right? I mean, especially if you're getting close to the end of the timeline when the auction's going to end. And in that last auction, I don't know if you guys listened, but in the last auction, we talked about shipping that $1 million ring from New York to Texas, and insurance, and how the best insurance coverage you could get with UPS is only 200 grand. So we talked about how you get additional supplemental insurance and things like that. But what if I'm considering purchasing that? I see a family heirloom. It's out in New York. It's $1 million. I have no idea. I don't have time. There's only 20 minutes left of the auction. I may be in or out on $1 million item if I can't ask a question. But if I could ask you a simple question and go, hey, seller, can this thing be insured up to $1 million? Yes, there's 3 different companies we know of that sell supplemental insurance, and you can also do that through a long haul carrier company. Oh, okay, great, I'm in. And that was a simple 5-second question. But if I can't get an answer to that, and I can't engage the seller, and they can't instill that, you keep calling it trust, I love that word. If they can't instill that trust that I know I can buy that item and trust that it's going to show up, I'm out. And I may just completely lose my bidders, right? So I think that really is important when we're talking about that interaction between the seller and the buyer. The last one here is really talking about the marketplace itself. Do you want to dive into how this is both super important? I mean, sheer volume, right? How many sellers are on Amazon? How many sellers were on Go Africa on that marketplace? We put, hundreds of thousands of sellers and millions of products.
Right.
How important is communication when it comes to marketplaces, especially?
Yeah, great point. It fundamentally makes or breaks everything, doesn't it? And it really boils down to how much self-service and intelligent governance can we bake into the process. And notifications are kind of where the governance really kind of gets executed in many cases. So, in notifying and keeping everyone apprised of what the rules are and what the best practices are, we're going to kind of put bumpers, if you will, into our bowling alley. And instead of having gutters, we've got these bumpers there. And we're kind of just constantly adjusting and keeping everyone on track with these notifications. And it's such a powerful opportunity as a auction e-commerce platform provider to be able to deliver this governance to both the sellers and the buyers. And this is fundamentally what they're coming to you for. So if you take that opportunity to not just transactionally interact, but also to kind of imbue this sense of kind of, if you will, community and community standards within your auction platform, it really can help you to take it to the next level, can it, Ron?
Yeah. And this, we keep saying the word notifications, but it really is true for all communication, right? If you think about it, and I remember we did and it wasn't an auction, it had nothing to do with it, but the same holds true. I remember a platform we did a while back called Campus to Careers. You remember that? And it was a big, huge platform we did that was nationwide,
Yes,
where it allowed all of the campuses and universities to publish and post openings for internships, right? And then it allowed anybody anywhere to go in and search for these internships and ask questions about the internships and engage. But the important thing about that was that the notifications and emails and messages all happened in the platform. And why was that true? Well, we didn't want professors sharing private emails with students and people getting private emails. Well, that's exactly the point I'm making here. In this marketplace, you remember I talked about in a previous one that eBay auction that I got screwed out of that album a couple weeks ago on eBay, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was mad, but I didn't want to leave them a bad review for fear that they would leave me a bad review over a $20 vinyl record. It just wasn't worth it to me. But the whole thing fell apart, and I think they're a cheat seller, and something should have happened. But right now, I can't reach out to them. I could go back to that seller, send them a note and say, hey, why did you do this? But nothing's going to come of it. But the most important thing is there can't be any repercussions for them and or me, because he or she doesn't know my private email. I don't know theirs. I can only communicate through the platform. So it's established this whole level of security, almost a little bit of anonymity, right? But there's this additional level of security and trust that if I went back and left them a bad review, the worst thing they could do is leave me a bad review in turn, right? They can't come after me. They can't charge after me. They can't stalk my Facebook. And so the platform itself, it's not only about the notifications, it's about establishing a secure communication platform across the whole thing, right?
That's right. Exactly.
So let's move on now. Bid's done. And now we're going to fulfill the product, right? So I've won an item, and let's kind of dive in. So you want to kind of go down through some of these fulfillment requirements and where the notifications are. And different notifications can come from the surveys and the reviews and things like that afterwards, right?
That's right. So, someone wins the auction. A lot of people don't. So the first thing we want to do is notify everyone what the outcome was. And sometimes it's surprising, but because the system is so self-service and automated in many ways for the bidding, sometimes people don't realize right away that they won the auction. So we want to let them know, hey, you actually won. Congratulations. And here's what's next. And really laying that out for them in a very clear way is absolutely critical so that the seller and the buyer have a great experience. In many cases with our clients, they're dealing with complex transactions. So this is not over yet. Fulfilling the item may be one of the most challenging aspects. If we're dealing with real estate, or we're dealing with expensive items or bulky items, or both, the complex shipping, customs and duties. So the main thing with the notification, first of all, is to not just give them all the information and make it very compelling and share kind of best practices, but it's also important to put timelines on things. And especially once we kind of get to this stage in the process, we want to make sure that the seller is, getting the proper engagement from the buyer, and vice versa. Just like the experience that you had with eBay, Ron, this is a similar situation for many of these large purchases. The seller is really kind of sitting on inventory, if you will, and they really need this transaction to get finished. And so the buyer needs to have a timeline to complete certain things by, or this is the fail safe. This is kind of the next step that's going to happen. And so the notifications really need to drive that behavior, both for the buyer and the seller. They need to be kind of confirming that they are going through this process once the buyer wins the auction, and the seller needs to confirm that they're also actively engaged. So that's the first thing. Having timelines and being able to see that there's some kind of a confirmation from both the buyer and the seller. So they're interacting, they're confirming. Normally, this is going to be options that they click on inside of the notifications themselves. This will take the user back to the auction platform to then interact. And then essentially, there's a workflow here that we want to complete. So fundamentally, part of that workflow is going to be customizing it to the specific auction type. And within your auction platform, you may have multiple auction types. You have multiple categories of auctions that you're running. And each of those need to be specific to that particular niche and to the workflows that are necessary to complete that process. So what we want to do, working with you and your team, is just make sure that the shipping, fulfillment, that any kind of escrow, any kind of proof of documentation, tracking information, etc., has a place to live in this process. And again, whenever the seller is inputting, hey, we shipped the item, here's the tracking info, the buyer wants to know about that right away. I mean, nowadays we're all, most people in society nowadays, we're very relatively impatient to get this detail and information right away as compared to 20, 40 years ago as a society. And you want to factor that in. Yeah, so we really need to be in a position where the seller, whenever they are completing this process, they can input the information and it has a place to live, and then the buyer's going to get that information. Same thing with the buyer. With some of these complex transactions, the buyer has a lot to do in order to conclude the auction and actually complete the full transaction. So they're going to be doing some complex things, and we need the seller to be able to see, yes, in fact, the buyer has completed this. So you can, a typical way that we'll do this is we'll show steps for both the buyer and the seller, and we'll show who's responsible at what time. So this is in the buyer's court. The seller is currently doing this. You can usually expect it to take this long. This is what we tell them is best practice. If it goes longer than that, feel free to da-da-da. And so we basically want to be very opinionated about what is expected, communicate that both the buyer and seller, and then show both buyer and seller where we are in the process. And so this is a really key part of the notification process. And fundamentally, it really, really helps to make sure that there's a really high satisfaction for both buyers and sellers.
Yeah, agreed. And this could be actually part of the expensive part of the platform, because that third bullet there, where there needs to be a detailed process, you can imagine buying a piece of sports memorabilia. The process of getting that fulfilled and shipped is going to be completely different from a property, right? Because earnest money and inspections and all kinds of things, that just takes time, and everybody expects that with a property. Nobody expects that with a Pokemon card, do they? Right? I mean, they expect not only fast food, it's now fast shipping and fast payment. Everything's fast. You said we're impatient, and it's true, but it's because we've figured out, in this age of technology, we've figured out how to do things fast. And you definitely, when you go to platforms, and it's funny, the one thing, my wife tells me this all the time, we joke around. She's like, I don't shop online at this place anymore. And I'm like, why? And she said, you spoiled me. And I'm like, why? And she goes, well, you guys build websites and you've educated me on what a good website is and performance. And she goes, now every time I go to a bad website and the experience is crappy, I'm just like, these guys have a bad process. They must be bad in business. And she just leaves and she won't shop online anymore at these places because she's so critical of the online experience, right? And I experienced that too, right?
Absolutely.
It's kind of funny.
It's a reflection of the underlying business, right?
It truly is, right? It was funny. It's Elizabeth Moss Cantor. She's one of the top 20 businesswomen in the world. She's a Harvard professor. She's published like 23 books. Brilliant, brilliant woman. She did a test a while back with, I think it was with Harvard and Carnegie. I might be off on that, but she did a study a number of years ago. And it said within the first 50 milliseconds of hitting a website, the person has already established a subconscious professionalism score for your business. So when people think design isn't important, or when people, come to an auction and they try to see a picture of an item you're selling, you don't think it's important that you have a nice picture or a good description, you couldn't be more wrong, right? So it's always funny with that. All right, so now the very last thing is the ratings, right? And I just mentioned it about that eBay item, but ensuring the customer is satisfied. And one of the most reasons is not because I want to make sure they're happy with their transaction, although I do. As the auction house, if they are satisfied, then the seller's probably going to come back and sell more stuff. And that buyer's probably going to come back and buy more stuff. And if my business is taking a small percentage, a small selling and buying commission off items, then the more people come back exponentially, obviously my profit goes up. So literally for the auction house, the most important thing is to ensuring the customer, and in this case, the customer is both the buyer and the seller, right? So let's go ahead and dive in and go ahead and talk about and let's start with returns, because that one's a big one, right?
Absolutely. Totally agree. I mean, this whole platform is based around credibility and really serving, like you said, Ron, the buyers and the sellers. And what is it that we can do to really optimally serve? Well, we can put mechanisms in place that guide them and direct them and kind of say, like, hey, if you make this choice, this is probably going to be the outcome. And so this is really important whenever it comes to refunds and returns, because this can be sort of an ethical thing for the seller and the buyer. And, they may be challenged with, gosh, I don't want to da 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 da. So I'm not going to take care of myself, and if that's how they feel, well, they're going to feel that way when they're on your platform. So you want to kind of put yourself in their shoes and, again, engage with experts who have been working in this field long enough to understand some of the dynamics and the realities. And fundamentally, what we're dealing with is really laying out what the kind of lanes are to stay in and showing both the sellers and the buyers what is okay and what isn't okay. And you would be surprised potentially at how much just basic clarification and basic guidance and basic enforcement really makes a difference. It's an exponential payoff, especially in this area. Generally speaking, whenever there are refunds or returns, we want to default to a massively over focused on making sure that the client satisfaction, the customer is very happy. This just can be make or break for the whole credibility of the platform. Well, as far as notifications are concerned, we can fully automate this process essentially, as completely as possible. This is a very standard part of this industry overall. And so you can take advantage of best practices from platforms that are literally, 100 or 1,000 times bigger as far as revenue going through their system, and employ those within your system. So this is going to include things like being able to provide an easy access for the buyer to notify both the platform and the seller if there is an issue. Being able to select from a very discrete, specific list of options that really go into all the potential scenarios that could have occurred. And we want to make sure that's a complete list for your industry and really think through all the different scenarios. And then essentially have a workflow. And there's a difference between a damaged item versus the wrong item was sent. I mean, those are very different situations. And we have a pretty major problem on our hands if the seller doesn't resolve we sent the wrong item. I mean, that's a pretty major issue, right? And so there should be consequences. And then similarly speaking, if an item was damaged in shipment, that's a very different issue too, because it's possibly not the seller doing anything wrong. But unfortunately, the buyer is not getting what they need. So there are a lot of other types of situations. Maybe the seller wasn't responding quickly enough, and so the buyer had to go with a different option. And that can be really frustrating as a seller. But, that's why we have all this communication talking about what the guidelines are. And, we want to have governance in place that can handle this so that whenever the buyer says, gosh, I have an event that I have to have this item for in a week. And if I don't have it by then, I'm going to have to go buy it for twice as much. I'm going to be frustrated, but I've got to have it. It's non-negotiable. And if the seller doesn't respond quickly enough and fulfill the item on time, what is the buyer supposed to do? So these are the kind of things that we can mostly automate through the platform. And then the other thing is we do need to be able to have a safety release valve, essentially, so that if needed, we can inject a direct kind of override or even direct human interaction. And this is really helpful as well, so that your internal team is receiving notifications too. So you can essentially take advantage of the notifications to, again, improve customer satisfaction with the platform. And whenever it gets to a point, and this will happen occasionally, where the automation just doesn't really encompass the specific scenario, then it makes perfect sense to inject someone manually from a customer support perspective to be able to address that issue.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, governance, again, we talked about governance on another one, but that is really a big important one here. I mean, especially when you're buying something used, right? If somebody's remodeled a car, I remember watching a show the other day, and a guy was redoing a 69 Camaro, and it was because a guy bought it on auction, and it was a 69, it had a 502 big block in it, and he got it, and when it got to the shop, he said it wasn't running right, and they went in and looked at the engine, and when they started running serial numbers, the seller had lied. It was an old 454 from the 70s that they had slapped a new intake manifold and some 502 valve covers on it and some nice headers on it. And since the pictures are a few feet away and they weren't showing the exact serial numbers, and so now the guy had already put new wheels and tires on it. He'd done something. So trying to get a refund now is completely weird, and he's had the car for a month or two and couldn't figure out what was wrong with it until that. And so now all of a sudden he figured out he got taken months after the transaction. So how, governance of that kind of stuff, you have to really be careful. You have to figure out and help and guide the people on what is an as-is auction, and all sales are final. And if the seller did actually lie, though, what is the repercussion, or how and where can I inject arbitration and mediation, and where can I inject my own third-party inspection, and are there certificates? And sometimes some of those things just can't be done. It can be, hey, as is, but the pictures I took of the car were 6 months ago and it started developing rust, so I went ahead and sold it, but the only pictures I had were 6 months old. So all of a sudden the car shows up and the pictures didn't have rust, but the car shows up with rust. And so now there's a discrepancy, but the governance says everything is as is. So now how do you address that? Well, maybe the only thing you have left is our very last bullet here, the notifications, right? I'm rating the seller. So now when I go in and rate that seller and give them a 1 star and say they lied, the picture of the quarter panel showed no rust whatsoever. The car showed up and it has rust, and here's a picture of it, and you leave that rating. Well, the karma kind of works itself out at that point, right? More than 1 or 2 bad reviews, and that seller's either 1, nobody wants to do business with them, or 2, you as the platform owner could then ban them for, those types of things. I mean, we hear about the TikTok bans and the shadow bans, and you hear about this stuff all the time, right? My account got banned off of Facebook and blah, blah, blah. You hear about these things. Well, that is the people coming in and enforcing their rules of governance because somebody, quote unquote, violated the guidelines, is typically the term you always hear, right?
That's right.
So you have to have those well in place. And sometimes the ratings really are the only recourse at the tail end that have some teeth, because those teeth can hurt, right? They bite both ways.
That's right. And speaking of ratings, we really appreciate everyone watching this webinar. We've got an awesome one coming up next week. If you would, smash the like button, hit subscribe. We'll have more of these on the way. And I just want to say thanks again, Ron. This has been a fun one, and I'll look forward to the next one.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye for now.